Hey America, visit our sponsor eartheasy.com right now. Click that link below and check out the LifeStraw, your ultimate personal, portable water filtration system in the event of a crisis or casual use. Click that link below, that's eartheasy.com.
Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is, of course, Monday, April 21st, 2014. Over the weekend, ESPN revisits the 10-year anniversary of the Pat Tillman murder. Again, Pat Tillman was murdered by his own troops, and this was lied about at the very, very top of the U.S. federal government, from our generals. The mainstream media helped to propagate this. And they flat out lied, not just to the American people, but to Pat Tillman's wife, Marie, his brother, Kevin, who was also enlisted, his father, his mother, and grossly blasphemized the death of an American hero, who was, in fact, shot by his own troops, many believe was murdered in a pre-planned, well-coordinated assassination attempt where they sent Pat Tillman and others literally into a kill zone. Makes no sense whatsoever unless you were literally setting the stage for murder and setting the stage for a really kind of a semi-public assassination. And then what happened is they used it as a spin job back in the United States of America, saying that he was shot by Durka Al-Qaeda, even though that wasn't true and everybody knew it from the highest level and law of the land in Washington, D.C., and sold it as pro-war propaganda for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of which Pat Tillman was sent to both. He died in Afghanistan. But now we have ESPN over the weekend, over Easter of all times, blasphemizing the story even more, revisiting Pat Tillman 10 years later on the 10-year anniversary, with Stephen Elliott here breaking up in tears at one point, saying he fears he might be the one that killed Pat Tillman. Now, all of this is just pure and utter nonsense, because the real story is the federal government lied, not just about Pat Tillman to his own family, but to the American people. And what it means is that the federal government can't be trusted. Now, Pat Tillman was shot 3 times right in the head. I mean, again, it couldn't have been a more pre-planned, highly targeted, what many believe to be part of a much larger conspiracy, in a pure assassination attempt of an individual who, by the way, was quoted. Pat Tillman was quoted by saying to a very close friend of his that once he had fought in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that Iraq, for example, was so effing illegal. This is what Pat Tillman had to say when he was fighting overseas. He was also scheduled to meet with famed anti-war critic and author, also intellectual, Noam Chomsky, when he returned, because he was to return a very public anti-war critic. And could you imagine how dangerous that would have been for the federal government, for somebody like Pat Tillman, who was loved and admired by millions of Americans for giving up a very lucrative, multi-million-dollar NFL career to go fight war overseas post-September 11th because he felt so passionately about what had happened to America, only to be disillusioned by the wars, to call them so effing illegal, according to accounts of with his friends, to return home, to meet with famed anti-war critics, to maybe even potentially write a book, and really to lead a counter-revolution against the wars in the United States. Conveniently, what many people believe was assassinated before he was able to return. In fact, there was a General Wesley Clark in 2007 during an appearance on Keith Olbermann's MSNBC show, said that the orders on Pat Tillman's death came from the very top to cover up the nature of Tillman's death, as he was a political symbol, and his opposition to the war in Iraq would have rallied the population around supporting immediate withdrawal. That was coming from General Wesley Clark, just not a regular Joe on the street, corroborating what many people believe to be a planned assassination. Again, 10 years it's been since this brutal massacre. What we know 100% is that the federal government is a stinking liar, that they blasphemized Pat Tillman's death and sold it as pro-war propaganda, told the world. In fact, I was at some of these football games, being from Arizona. In fact, I remember being at one with Pat Tillman's family in tears, selling him as a war hero who was gunned down by Al-Qaeda, Durka, and they flew jets above the stadium at the time. All of that wasn't true. Now, I believe Pat Tillman to be a hero, and I believe he died for a just, worthy cause. It's just not the cause that he may have thought he went overseas to fight. What Pat Tillman did is he exposed the gruesome reality that makes up the federal government here in the United States. A liar and a torturous, deceitful, hateful government that covers up shit and hurts innocent people, like Pat's wife here, who has since remarried, Marie, looking on in California 10 years later, trying to make amends with just such a tragic experience and a hellacious experience her and her family have had to go through and have been through, having to come to terms with their own government lying and blasphemizing their loved one so that they can spin it and do another con job, not just on them, but the American people at large as they fight illegal wars overseas. Again, this isn't just happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya, folks, or even Yemen. It's now happening in Ukraine. Another con job, another spin job by the traitorous U.S. federal government, all the way at the top, sitting in an ivory castle, whether or not this is the President of the United States or it's some of our four-star generals. You can see another article here from Fox Sports. This former Army Ranger fears he shot fallen NFL star Pat Tillman. Again, this is not even the real story, folks. And this is what I find so tragic about a man who was just so courageous and who loved this country and loved America and stood up for everything that it meant, and who really is a shining beacon of light for so many people that admire what Pat Tillman had done, dies at the hands of his own traitorous, murderous government. And that's just the truth. That's not my opinion. That's what's happened. That's what did happen. It was a cover-up. Everyone knows it in Pat Tillman's family, and everyone should know it here in the United States of America. ESPN does a video on it. In fact, you can watch it. I'm not going to play it because they'll probably nab me for copyright or something like that. But if you watch, you can see that the convoy is literally set into a kill zone. And then all of a sudden, they just literally start opening fire. They happen to put 3 rounds into Tillman's brain via an M16, killing an Afghan. And just an utter tragedy. But it just goes to show you what a just insane position that our leadership put Tillman in, as well as this convoy, because it was literally like they were trying to kill him, which many people think to be the case. SI also does a report on it, Sports Illustrated, saying how Pat Tillman's death, re-examined by ESPN over the lines, just brings about more media circus. Now, again, Pat Tillman was to meet with this guy here, Noam Chomsky, right after he was to return from Afghanistan. And many believe that Pat Tillman was to become a very eager, aggressive, and passionate anti-war critic who was going to rally millions of Americans against the wars here in the United States. I mean, even a general said it here, General Wesley Clark. I mean, could you imagine the anti-war rhetoric and the type of leadership that could have come about with Pat Tillman returning and meeting with people like Noam Chomsky and speaking in conventions? I mean, literally, Pat Tillman could have organized millions of people here in America. Everybody loved him. He could have been president of the United States. Suddenly and conveniently wound up dead with 3 large bullet wounds to the face in a event that we know factually was lied about to the American public and used as pro-war propaganda to sell dirty, illegal wars overseas. Now, many of you probably know this. Some of you probably don't. But General Stanley McChrystal was at the helm of all control over the Afghanistan conflict when Pat Tillman died. And here we have an article where John says here that McChrystal's explanation for the Pat Tillman cover-up is preposterous, referring to General Stanley McChrystal. He should ring a bell. He should be familiar. In fact, let me give you a picture of him so you would recognize him. And I'll point something else out here in a moment. Here we have General Stanley McChrystal. Many of you probably recognize him. Again, he was the general overseeing all of Afghanistan during the Afghanistan War and the cover-up that made up Pat Tillman's death. Pat Tillman's father at one point, when they were pushing for the truth, and this all led to full disclosure and the fact that the United States was a bunch of lying, just traitorous scumbags that had used Pat Tillman and his son is really just pro-war U.S. bullshit propaganda. At one point, told an Army investigator, "F you and yours." Again, Pat Tillman himself saying that the war in Iraq, referring to really both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, were so effing illegal. And his dad saying, "F you" to Army investigators. Again, General Stanley McChrystal, who oversaw the entire Afghanistan conflict and war, and he was also grossly a part of the Pat Tillman cover-up, also just happens to be connected to that other guy, Michael Hastings. Remember him? Investigative journalist, died at 33 in a conspiratorial car crash that just happened to blow up into a burst of flames right after he'd come out with reports that axed General Stanley McChrystal in his piece, The Runaway General, in Rolling Stone, in his last article investigating the NSA spying grid and the spy program here in the United States. Stanley McChrystal, again, who was overseeing the Afghanistan war, was forced to step down after Michael Hastings' awesome investigative report of truth that exposed McChrystal, as well as others, making detrimental comments to the Obama administration and White House staff, later ended with Obama letting McChrystal go, essentially firing him as a result of Michael Hastings' blistering article of truth. And then, of course, years later, Michael Hastings, not too long ago, just recently, ends up dead. Just another young kid like Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman being 27 when he was murdered, and many people believe assassinated by the federal government in a massive conspiratorial cover-up, which again has come to light really on a daily basis. Again, the government originally lying about the story about Pat Tillman originally, and then coming and admitting that they lied pretty much about it after being exposed. Michael Hastings also dead at 33. Allegations being he was, using drugs or something like that. But, he just happened to be responsible for exposing this guy, the same guy overseeing the war in Afghanistan and the Pat Tillman cover-up, allegedly, also dead, whacked at 33. This vibrant, bright, amazing mind, one of the best journalists of our time, who had brought down single-handedly General Stanley McChrystal and forced Obama to really can his ass in a ball of fury, winds up dead. All of this, folks, the hardcore truth, all of this won't be exposed or talked about in a Pat Tillman 10-year revisiting story via ESPN over the line. They ignore what's important about this story. What's important about this story is Pat Tillman was murdered in what many people believe was a government conspiratorial cover-up to kill this guy so he couldn't come back to the United States and lead a revolution here in the United States against the ugly, illegal, traitorous, homicidal wars overseas in the Middle East. Wars that Pat Tillman himself even called so effing illegal. You know, here you have a hero, an American war hero, who was lied about to his own family members, who must have been through severe trauma, pain, and suffering with his loss. Lied to by their own government at the various high levels in law of the land, sitting in their ivory towers in Washington, D.C. And all of this, of course, builds a connection some of you probably weren't even familiar with, that I just had to point out today. Another young man, dead, whacked, what many people believe was murdered as a result of his investigative journalism, bringing down General Stanley McChrystal virtually single-handedly in his scathing reports, and also covering the NSA spy grid and what was happening with Edward Snowden and those leaks at the time. Also just happens to be whacked. Winds up dead in a mysterious, fiery car crash in the middle of the night, screaming down the road. Many people believe his car was controlled remotely, hundreds of miles per hour, before just conveniently igniting into a ball of fury, and his engine literally jumping from the seams of the car and, flying 20 feet out of his Mercedes. Again, folks, this isn't genius work. You don't have to be a 4-star detective to figure it out. At the very least, we've identified clear and abundant motive. And you can only imagine, if you were Pat Tillman's own family, his father, his brother Kevin, his mother, and his wife, his former wife Marie, how they must feel, knowing that somebody they loved, that they knew on a deep personal level, outside of all the propaganda, outside of, putting Pat Tillman on a pedestal, but someone that they cared about, admired, and loved. His life blasphemized on all days on Easter yesterday. And ESPN failing to admit and to point out the real story over the lines that you'll only get here at AMTV, Alternative Media Television. I'm Christopher Green. Get it out everywhere, make it viral, and click the link below to support our sponsor.